happy to start? I'll just start the recording.
I'm happy.
Cheers, Chair. Recording should have started, Chair.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Homes and Safe Communities Scrutiny Committee on the 6th of July 2022. May I remind everyone present that the meeting is being live streamed as well as recorded via the internet, and this recording archived for future viewing. Could all participants please mute themselves when not speaking in order to avoid any background noise or feedback when other participants are speaking. If a participant wishes to speak, can they please put their hand up if they can be seen on screen, or use the raise hand function. Please ensure that all debate is raised verbally and not via the chat function for the sake of the recording. The chat function may be used to highlight any technical difficulties or technical issues to the chairman or Democratic Services Officer. If any participant has difficulty hearing or being heard when they are addressing the committee, then they should let the chairman know or Democratic Officer know. If they have a webcam, then they should try turning this off, as this will help the broadband or Wi-Fi bandwidth, so at least they can hear and be heard. So hello everyone. Agenda item 1 is apologies for absence. I've not received any. Have we got any to come?
Yes, Chair. We've got apologies from Councillor Campbell and also from Mrs. Gina Doyle, tenant representative.
Okay. Agenda item 3 is, agenda item 2 is the minutes of the meeting held on the 15th of June 2022. Is everybody happy with these?
Yes, Chair, I'm happy to accept.
Okay, so move and note those, yes? Okay, I can see a lot of nodding heads, thank you. Agenda item 3 is declarations of interest. Have we got any? Speak now or forever hold your peace. Nope. Okay, thank you. Agenda item 4 is for reference. It's the annual corporate safeguarding report 2021 to 22 that went to Cabinet on the 9th of June 22. If you'd like to come in, Mike.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. As members will be aware, whilst this is a report to the Director of Social Services via the responsible Cabinet member, this report, as is tabled in the Cabinet report, is passed to each of the scrutiny committees in the Council for consideration on the various elements pertinent to that scrutiny committee, and therefore each of the leads at scrutiny presents the report. But just to summarise, as members are aware, there's corporate responsibility for us to ensure that we have effective arrangements for safeguarding of children and adults who touch on our council services. And the annual report 2021-22 provides an overview of those corporate arrangements as the report states. In terms of the background to the report, the Social Services and Wellbeing Act 2014 brought about introduction of a duty to report, but also required a revision of corporate safeguarding policies across local authorities and statutory partners. And the report goes on to talk around the regional arrangements. There is a Cardiff and Vale Regional Safeguarding Board that oversees those statutory requirements that are implemented in both Cardiff and the Vale of Glamorgan. In terms of the report under section 2, key issues for consideration, you'll note that the Vale of Glamorgan Council led on the delivery and development of the national all Wales safeguarding procedures back in November 2019. And for members who have yet to see the safeguarding procedures, just a note really. They are contained within an app which you can place on your phone. I don't think we expect people to walk around with the procedures in their top pockets, but there is an app, and I'm sure Mark can direct you to that app, which can be downloaded to your corporate device. Going on, the report reflects and highlights on activity that's been ongoing in the last year, and reflects on a couple of areas. One of which is we've implemented an electronic DBS, data barring service check system in the Vale of Glamorgan, which has speeded up the access to information for both the council and for staff who are required to have DBS checks as part of their role. We also referred to the VODA SV strategy, the violence against women, domestic abuse and sexual violence, and I'll come to that in a little bit more detail as we look at the relevant section within the report itself. And finally, a reflection that the COVID-19 pandemic had impacted on service delivery, but the report highlights that regardless of that, safeguarding activity continued during that period of time for the most vulnerable people within our communities, to ensure that they were supported and protected. If I move on then to the report itself, the report, as you can see, as Appendix 1, it's a fairly standard format in terms of what has been reported in previous years. It breaks the report down into the various what were at the start of the year, which were the 4 various directorates. Clearly, we have 5 now with the Directorate of Place as well. But in terms of the 4 sections, the areas which fall under the remit of this committee, and I will concentrate on this evening, fall under Section D. So if I can ask members, if they have the report in front of them, to move through to Section D. The report itself obviously reflects a lot of activity across the council, and what I need to mention is that we do have a Chief Officer corporate group, a corporate safeguarding group. I'm a member of that group. It's led by the Director of Social Services as the responsible officer for safeguarding within the Vale of Glamorgan Council area, and has been represented by in previous years by the cabinet member. That remit includes social services. But as I say, if we move through to Section D, and I'll briefly go through the various elements there that you can see in front of you. So if we start with housing's response to safeguarding activity, as you can see from the report, all of the housing team are trained to the appropriate level in safeguarding practice. Safeguarding is a standard item on our regular departmental meetings and agenda items then for our staff meetings. When I talk about housing, I'm also including building services, because our frontline housing maintenance staff, who are obviously probably accessing our tenants' homes on a more regular basis, have also been trained in safeguarding practice and do make referrals where they see any issue of concern. Staff, some of my senior management staff are part of the regional safeguarding arrangements, as I mentioned earlier, and my operational manager undertakes child and adult practice reviews on behalf of the board since being trained in that activity. In terms of other areas of note and to highlight, we also attend as a directorate and as a team on our MARAC meetings, our multi-agency meetings that discuss high profile, high risk cases. And the report also mentions as I said earlier, that even with COVID, and even though the number of home visits were restricted, clearly given the statutory position and guidance at that time, we undertook over the period 1,200 telephone welfare checks on those residents and tenants that we knew were vulnerable and potentially whose well-being and safeguarding could have been cause for concern. We're in the process at the moment, and this will go on for a few more months yet, of undertaking a tenant profiling exercise, and that doesn't sound as bad as it does in terms of Big Brother. When we obviously know a lot about our tenants when they move into our properties. What we don't know is, after a number of years, whether their circumstances have changed or what those circumstances might necessarily be. Family size may have increased, circumstances may have changed, as I say. Now, what we identified during COVID, I think, is that intelligence in terms of being able to target support was an issue for us, in that it was somewhat of a scattergun approach. We didn't necessarily know which ones needed interventions and which ones needed serious interventions sooner rather than later. So the profiling, we're going through an exercise of asking some questions of our tenants. Tenants don't have to respond if they don't wish to, but it gives us a better indication really about what services we need to provide going forward, where the specific focus is, and particularly at a time like now, in terms of cost of living issues, it gives us the ability to try and better target financial support and our money advice service to those that really need it or will continue to need it over the coming period. Moving on, just to there is a typo which I've noticed in paragraph 7, because it mentions activity in 2019-20. That should read 2021-22, sorry. And you can see the number of multi-agency referrals that the service have made. The majority of those are within our housing solutions service, because by virtue of the fact that they are dealing with the most vulnerable people in our area, those people who are coming to us with particular issues around domestic abuse and violence, issues around drugs and alcohol, issues around homelessness, mental health, those are the people that would flag and would highlight, I suppose, in terms of some concerns that we may have in relation to ensuring that they have wraparound support provided to assist them in maintaining tenancies. And as you can see, some activity there. We also undertake safeguarding assessments for everyone that goes into the hostel or into temporary accommodation, and that practice has been in place for a number of years now, to ensure that colleagues across the council are aware of that potentially their clients are with us, because that isn't always known, and to ensure that, you know, my staff that operate from the hostel are able to give the most appropriate support that we can. Moving through the report, there's mentioned there in terms of our COVID response, in terms of the provision of temporary accommodation, and the requirement at the time clearly for, and we'll pick this up on a later report, around the fact that a responsibility on local authorities to ensure that anyone that was homeless or threatened with homelessness were provided with accommodation through the pandemic. And it goes on to talk around the response that we were required to make at that stage in terms of the use of bed and breakfast accommodation, which, although not ideal in the situation and circumstances, was necessary. One thing I would point out is that we continue to use bed and breakfast. We continue to provide support and wraparound services as if we were still in the middle of the pandemic, because we still have over 80 people at the moment currently in bed and breakfast accommodation, and all of those people are single person households. If I move through to our safeguarding practice in relation to the community safety team, and particularly in response to the violence against women, domestic abuse and sexual violence strategy. As you can see, the focus of that work falls on our Safer Vale team, and there are some quite a lot of statistics and figures there in terms of activity. So just to give you a flavour of that, so I've mentioned MARAC cases. These are the high risk cases of victims of domestic abuse, where we discussed those in a multi-agency practice. We had 363 of those cases in the 21-22 period. But I would also note that what we also introduced last year were twice weekly telephone discussions. Those MARAC meetings would happen on a weekly, fortnightly basis. And given the delay from a case being referred as high risk to MARAC and for a multi-agency discussion, we're now undertaking telephone discussions twice a week to ensure that appropriate support is provided as quickly as possible. We also note in there that there were 413 of those twice weekly meetings. And you can see the importance of having those early intervention meetings, because 142 of those were high risk and went on to have full MARAC discussions. In paragraph 13, we talk about the DARC service, and for new members who don't know what DARC stands for, that's our domestic abuse referral coordinating service for those cases which are deemed to be low or medium risk. Those cases would not ordinarily go to a full MARAC review. This service was introduced a couple of years ago, pre-pandemic, and it came about as a result of a case in the Vale of Glamorgan, which led to a serious case review, and it was one of the recommendations that was implemented as a result of that. The fact that the low and medium cases can escalate unless there is oversight of those cases. And what we were tending to find is that the PPNs, the public protection notices, which the police complete, were often not prioritised in terms of follow-up. And as a result of which, in this particular serious case review, there was an indication that had it been followed up by a service, it may have resulted in a different outcome in that particular incident. So the DARC service is coordinated through the community safety team. They receive all of the PPNs across the Vale of Glamorgan Council. And as you can see, we received 630 PPNs. One note of caution, however, because they are police referrals, they require, under South Wales Police procedures, they require consent in order to refer. That is an issue. We have raised that through our Safer Vale board that oversee our Safer Vale arrangements across the council and with our local partners. Those procedures are being reviewed because our concern is that we are missing potentially cases that we could intervene with in a sympathetic way, to at least highlight and to signpost residents to appropriate services if they wish. However, as I say, the fact that that they're only referred to with consent is a concern for us that is being reviewed. The last area in relation to domestic violence and abuse, which I'll refer to, is the practice of target hardening. Target hardening is not a great term, is it? And I wish we should call it something else, but that is primarily how it's understood across the spectrum. Target hardening is where we implement measures in somebody's home, a victim's home, in order to provide a safe refuge for that person in their home, for those people who choose to remain or want to remain in their home. And as you can see, we support that through our Supporting People grant mechanism, funds the interventions, which could be CCTV, additional lighting, additional security measures. And in 21-22, we target hardened 116 of those properties, which obviously goes some way to providing a more cost-effective service rather than necessarily looking at the costs of refuge provision. However, as I say, there is a risk assessment undertaken at that point. It's not always the safest mitigation to target harden in all circumstances, and it has to be in agreement with the victim. In terms of there's mention in there of Ask and Act, just to quickly follow on, that's the training. That there is national training framework across Wales. Ask and Act is effectively the lower levels of training about asking the right questions and understanding. And I mentioned earlier that the housing staff have had that training, but just to pick up on the fact that 94% of our workforce in the council have received level 1 training, awareness training. And in terms of the rollout of level 2, as you can see, 51 sessions, and we've delivered that to 704 attendees. So an awful lot going on in that particular area of activity. I'll sort of flag antisocial behaviour, just to mention that ASB is an issue that's becoming a major concern for us. We understood that ASB during COVID was being fueled by perhaps different motivations. However, and I'm sure as members you are seeing and potentially getting a lot of complaints around ASB in your wards, and this is a pattern that is on the increase. There is work ongoing at the moment around summer activities, because we tend to apply a multi-agency response to ASB, certainly during summer and after the schools have closed for the summer. And you will see on social media and other outlets a lot of activity going on in terms of how we safeguard young people and the impacts of ASB that we all know too well, really. Finally, on the housing element, before I hand over to Helen to give you an overview of the SRS implications, just to mention Channel Panel. Channel Panel is part of the Home Office response to terrorism. There are a number of strands, and Channel Panel is one of those strands. And I know colleagues on the call will have had presentations from my staff in the past looking at terrorism specifically. Channel Panel is effectively a multi-agency regional group who look at those individuals that may be vulnerable to groups or individuals in relation to terrorist activity, and those panel meetings meet as and when necessary, as and when individual cases are flagged, and a multi-agency response then about interventions to obviously educate and to try and obviously manage and safeguard that individual, but more importantly to ensure that communities are safe as well. I'll stop there in terms of the housing part. Helen obviously will pick up on some of the SRS activity and some of the valuable work that they do in relation to scams and other things. And then obviously Helen and I'd be happy to answer any questions in relation to this committee's remit.
Thanks, Mike. I'm in difficulty getting my camera to come on there. Good evening again, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to talk through the SRS involvement in the corporate safeguarding report. Much of this will be familiar to you. You were kind enough to take a look at the SRS business plan only a few weeks ago ahead of the last meeting. But I hope that what I'll run through here between paragraphs 25 and 34 will give you more of a focus on how SRS, the responsibilities of SRS feed into that wider safeguarding picture across the council. So what I'm going to do is to talk about three specific areas, and the first of those is our role in safeguarding of older and vulnerable adults. We also have an input into safeguarding of young people. And then the third and last section relates to the licensing of taxi drivers. So I will start at paragraph 26, just talking about that first category, which is safeguarding of older and vulnerable adults. And this, unfortunately, continues to be a big area of work for us. There are a lot of very, very unpleasant people out there who continue to target vulnerable, often older people who unfortunately are victimised as a result of either having work done to their homes or very often taking a phone call and being taken in with a scam. So we respond to a large number of cases over the course of each year, and then we'll have a more involvement or a greater involvement with individuals supporting residents through the problems that they have encountered. And very often that needs to involve the families as well, who quite often won't realise that older relatives are possibly being repeatedly targeted by some of these scams and criminals. So I've mentioned in section 27 of the report just one example of a scam where someone was taken in by an approach to have some white goods insurance, and I think we've all been on the receiving end of those, either by letter or phone call. And what started as a relatively low-level scam of around £80 resulted in the loss of a further £8,000 plus as a result of the individual's credit card details being used for online purchases. Overall, we were able to, through our interventions, get some £13,000 in redress for residents. But unfortunately, that is the tip of an iceberg of just an awful lot of detriment which is being incurred. And very often, individuals don't like to mention the fact that they've been targeted in this way. Sometimes they can see it as a bit of a weakness, something they don't want to admit to friends and family, but it happens to everyone, although we're talking about older and vulnerable residents, because they do tend to be most frequently targeted. This can happen to any of us, because there's some very clever people out there behind these scams. Paragraph 28, going to talk about a doorstep crime case. And when we talk about doorstep crime, what we mean there is people being ripped off when they're having work done to their properties. And it very often is work that they didn't even think that they needed to have done. But these traders, should we call them, will often call door to door, spot errors and issues with properties. The roof is in danger of collapse, or you need your chimney taken down, you need this piece of work, loose slates, whatever it is, and they're very, very plausible, and they convince people that they need work doing. So it's just one case here where following the classic MO for doorstep criminals. They start work, they convince people that work is needed, they start that work, and then when the work kind of gets to the point of no return, for example, the roof has been taken off or the driveway has been dug up, they then find other issues, problems with the foundations, problems with the supporting beams in the roof, whatever it is, and the already very expensive work, it will just skyrocket in price. And we've seen some dreadful cases where individuals literally have lost life savings as a result of their encounters with some of these individuals. In order to spread the word, and we're constantly trying to get the message out there as much as we can and refresh those messages. We've been working with GP surgeries, pharmacies, dentists, getting resources out so that when people are sitting in waiting rooms, they can pick up and read some of that information. And we're also about to start, and I realise this isn't in this current year for what you're scrutinising this evening, but right now we're starting some work with hairdressers. We find that hairdressers and barbers very often is a place where people will have conversations that perhaps they wouldn't otherwise have. And we're keen to get that awareness out to hairdressers and barbers so that they can pick up on some of those warning signs and help people to report incidents to us so that we in turn can assist. Paragraph 30 then, again, you'll be familiar with these devices, call blockers, and these are the devices that can be simply installed. We have not a massive number, but we have a little stock of them that we're able to install for those most in need. And the beauty of these is that friends and family are still able to get through, but only those numbers will get through to the landline. So all scam calls, they can't get through. And it's estimated that on average, the call blockers prevent 5 nuisance or scam calls a day. And I think that that very fact demonstrates just how valuable these devices are in preventing more misery. Paragraph 31 then mention safeguarding of young people, and of course our role in underage sales here is key. And just to highlight perhaps an emerging trend that we're encountering more and more, I mentioned in paragraph 32, and that is with regard to electronic cigarette products. Big problem with them being supplied with non-compliant capacity, so that the capacity for the fluid is much greater than it should be. It should only be a relatively small amount that it's able to contain, and also the nicotine volume or concentration, it should be 20 milligrams per milliliter, and invariably some of these will be much more than that. So that in itself is a problem. We've done some seizures, and the last count we'd seized product, non-compliant product, equivalent to retail value of about £19,000. But particularly important with this, of course, is the fact that they are being supplied to young people too, and all the dangers associated with that in getting them hooked on e-cigarettes and then possibly a gateway to tobacco. Yes, mentioned there that SRS did some work with BBC X-ray to highlight the problem of that. And then the last section that I mentioned is licensing of taxi drivers. And of course, for the Vale Council, we provide the licensing service. And the vast majority of taxi drivers are reputable and do exactly what is expected of them. But there will be occasions where SRS needs to protect the public, particularly the vulnerable. And over the course of 2021-22, 4 cases were referred to licensing committees following conviction for various offences or for alleged inappropriate behaviour. So hopefully that gives a very quick run through, give you a feel of our focus really on safeguarding. Very small teams actually carrying out this work, but I hope you agree it is very impactful, the work that they do. So I'm not sure now if I'm passing back to Mike for the last part of this report, or if I'm passing back to you, Chair.
Just to summarise, really, safeguarding is a particular focus of every individual officer, and I'm sure every member of the council. We have legal and statutory responsibilities. We have duties as individuals to report where necessary. I know from this report from last year, where we gave this report, some concerns were raised from a member's perspective around whether there was a requirement or otherwise of members to be DBS checked, and I think a report went through to Cabinet last year, indicating that there were some positions that where members were particularly and regularly involved in meetings and activities, including children and vulnerable adults, that they should be DBS checked. And for other members, it was a matter of, I think there was a recommendation that could be something that would be supported if members wished to do that, but of course it would be an individual member's own, down to an individual's own responsibility whether they wish to do so or not. The corporate safeguarding board safeguarding group continues to meet. If there are issues and concerns that are reflected from yourselves on any of the various directorates or concerns, please feed them through. There are corporate pages on the council's StaffNet pages in relation to corporate safeguarding, with lots of advice and links and who to speak to, who the corporate leads are across the council, so you can direct some of those to those corporate leads. And as I say, you know, if any member wishes further information on advice on corporate safeguarding practice, please don't hesitate to contact us. Thank you, Chair.
No problem. This is for reference, but does anybody have any questions? Okay, Julie, go ahead.
Oh, thank you, Chair. We had on the last meetings, I remember a fantastic presentation on loan sharks, and I'm not sure if it's Helen or be Mike, because we have new members here, could you just tell us where we could report them to, and what, I can't remember what the agency is called for loan sharks that we report them to. Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Councillor Avia. The Wales Illegal Money Lending Unit, it's hosted by SRS, so they are responsible for dealing with illegal money lenders, loan sharks, right across Wales. So what I can do is to share with you contact details. What I would say is that very often people who are actually in the grip of loan sharks are very hesitant themselves to report the matter, and very often, as you may recall from, I believe it was Liz Emmons spoke with Scrutiny Committee previously, and Liz will have explained that our role is very much to engage with people who are engaging with those individuals, possibly through you know, citizens' advice or through housing associations or whatever it is, to actually be able to reach out to them, because they won't reach out to us. So it is a kind of a two-way thing. By all means, I will share the information. There will be a new Wales Illegal Money Lending Unit website launching very soon. And again, we hope that will be another means of raising the profile and making as easy as possible contact.
Thank you. Councillor Gareth Ball.
Hi, just a couple of queries for Mike, actually. Of the people who are at high risk of domestic abuse that are staying in temporary accommodation, are they offered target hardening, and how are they prioritised for permanent accommodation?
Okay, so we work with Atul of Row, who are the third sector organisation who provides specific bespoke guidance and advice to clients that are referred into service. In terms of where we provide temporary accommodation, then as I've mentioned, I think at the outset, we would risk assess the appropriateness of that accommodation. We wouldn't use temporary accommodation that would place an individual at risk. Obviously, there is refuge accommodation as well, where although it's extremely limited, it's limited in the Vale, it's limited across Wales, and I'm sure, you know, on most days during the week, that refuge accommodation is often full. So it's about assessing the risk and the appropriateness of the accommodation that's available and is offered. In terms of the council's responsibility in relation to its duties under housing legislation, Councillor Ball, the council's allocations policy gives priority within its scheme to those that where there is confirmed domestic abuse or violence, and we prioritise in terms of rehousing through the normal scheme, through the normal waiting list scheme. You don't have to be homeless or in refuge or in order to have that priority. And as I mentioned, not everyone wants to leave their home necessarily, but needs to move from their home because of perhaps a child as being and we know the issue around ACEs, don't we, that adverse childhood experiences, domestic violence is one of the key indicators of one of those ACEs. So there may be circumstances where the family will want to move. There are other circumstances where refuge is not appropriate, particularly if you have older children and particularly older male children, because not all refuges will take children, male children of a certain age as well. In terms of homelessness provision, we're guided by the Housing Wales Act, and clearly it's a key priority, not just for the local authority, but a key priority, obviously, for Welsh Government in relation to policy direction, that victims are given priority in terms of rehousing going forward. So hopefully that answers your question. But if there is a specific issue, please let me know.
Thanks very much.
Okay, Councillor Lovelock-Edwards.
Thank you, Chair. I've got a couple of questions. The first to Mike. It's fantastic to see that 94% of the workforce have undertaken the level 1 training around violence against women and girls. Is there a plan to sort of encourage councillors, elected members, to participate in the same sort of training? And if not, is that something that could be sort of considered? And you cited that there were still 80 people deemed to be homeless. And do you have any analysis in terms of gender or age profile around those individuals?
Yeah, if I respond to the first issue, Councillor Lovelock-Edwards, there are various levels of training, mandatory training, from level 1 through to, I think it's level 8, off the top of my head. Level 1 is basic awareness, and the 94% relates to all staff generally. The reason it's not 100%, and there is a requirement or a performance measure to be 100%, a number of the sessions are obviously dealing with frontline staff that don't have access to electronic means, and most of the training rollout for level 1 was via the council's OD team using technology. So those services were delivered face to face at the Alps, through or through toolbox type discussions with frontline services. So there's a little bit of catch up there. In terms of members, chief officers, strategists, policymakers, there is training required for members, as well as heads, directors and chief executives, and I'm sure that training will be rolled out. Off the top of my head, I don't know in terms of new members when that would be. Some existing members may well have had that training previously, but I'll double check with our domestic violence lead, a lady called Julie Grady, that some of the members will know. But I'll speak to Julie, who's the coordinator for training, and I'll provide Mark with an update, and he can share that with members of the committee. In terms of your second point, the vast majority, over 80% of the individuals in bread and breakfast are male. They are young males in the main, the majority being under 40 years of age. And I suppose the challenge for us in the Vale Glamorgan is we have some individuals who have been in bed and breakfast accommodation in excess of a year, and that's really not acceptable on a number of fronts, really. One is bed and breakfast. We don't believe bed and breakfast is a suitable accommodation provision. However, as I mentioned, during COVID, we had no choice. And as a result, the council, as you probably are aware, the council are actively looking at alternative accommodation provision. We prioritise in terms of our own new builds, but also new build with our partner RSLs. We prioritise one-bedroomed or smaller units of accommodation because, as a traditional local authority, we built family homes in post-war. 2, 3, 4-bedroom houses. What we don't have a lot of are apartments, flats for single people. So we prioritise those in our developments going forward, and you'll see one of our associations now with, for example, recently the reopening of the Windsor Public House at the top of Houghton Road has been converted, and there's a substantial number of single person units there. What we're finding, however, is that 80 number has been fairly consistent now for a number of months, even with people moving out into alternative accommodation. We're still seeing lots of referrals, single person referrals coming in. And I think that's probably reflective of the hidden homelessness issue, not just in the Vale, but across Wales, where people have tended to be sofa surfing, sharing accommodation, that given the fact that local authorities are obliged to continue to provide accommodation for everyone, and we certainly don't want to go back to the days pre-COVID, where we have issues with rough sleeping and as I say, that hidden homelessness. It's incumbent on us to increase the capacity for this cohort, because there's significant numbers. Some of our responses, we are looking at procurement and purchase of existing properties, either to use as they stand or convert into appropriate accommodation. We're mindful that there are a relatively small number of those people who require additional support and services to maintain their tenancies. And we're looking at bespoke accommodation supported housing accommodation solutions for those. Just to flag, and I suppose to just in terms of what's been in the local press recently, we're not looking, currently at a specific accommodation for that. But it's a requirement that we know that is a gap in terms of our accommodation provision, and we're working hard. We have, for those of you who have seen Court Road, our MMC development there that we developed last year. We're trying to find alternative sites where we can develop something similar to that. But of course, I think you'll hear me mention that in terms of land, the council doesn't have a great deal of land in which to build new housing. So that continues to be a challenge.
Thank you, Mike. And my last point was to Helen, and it was in relation to the work that you'd undertaken with X-ray programme. And I was interested around, obviously we're in the midst of summer, and the use of sunbeds amongst the under 18s. It seems to be on the rise again. Is there any planned work around tackling that issue in the Vale? Thank you.
We don't have a survey planned currently, but we will be engaging with the proprietors of the sunbed premises to remind them what their responsibilities are. So we obviously, when we have information through, and clearly some non-compliances were identified by BBC X-ray. So where we have non-compliance reported to us, then of course we will deal with that directly. What we will be doing is to remind those premises of their responsibilities. And clearly, if we need to follow that up with some sort of test purchasing attempt, then we will look to do that. But it isn't on our list at the moment, because clearly, again, there are safeguarding issues of putting youngsters into that sort of situation. So it's quite a fine balance.
Councillor Perks.
Thank you, Chair. I've got a couple of questions. For Mike, I just wondered whether after COVID finished, did we get more reports of domestic abuse that had occurred during the COVID period? Did people manage to, I know that there was stuff in the media and stuff that people could still contact everybody, but have we had more reports of domestic violence that happened within the COVID period that have come to light now?
No, and I think we've reported that during the pandemic. We were surprised, I think, to see that numbers were decreased and have not increased as potentially we might have expected. I would suspect that an awful lot of that was some of the interventions were put in place in terms of the activities which Helen mentioned, funny enough, by ensuring that there were other means by which people could report outside of the normal statutory, through officers and whatever, and we did the same. We spoke to GP surgeries and other outlets, pharmacies and the like, where people could report. So no, the numbers haven't increased greatly. Why would that be? I don't know. We anticipated that would happen. We put services in place in the event that it did. We're concerned that, in terms of consent may be an issue, in that there are issues which are not being reported and referred to us that would have been in the past, which might impact on the numbers that are coming through the PPNs. But as I say, no, we're not seeing that impact at the moment.
And do you think there'll be a resolution soon to the issue about the PNs and it you being notified so that we have up-to-date information?
Yeah, and we're working hard with colleagues in South Wales Police who sit on the Safer Vale Partnership Group. I think there are differences in the issues in Cardiff and in the Vale. In Cardiff, I think it's because they have a centralised hub of all agencies together, where the passing of that information is deemed to be safe and secure, I suppose. And I think the difference in the Vale is that doesn't exist. But we're working with the police to get them to revisit their procedures, because, as I say, I think it's imperative that any cases, and we know that, looking at the evidence that we have, you know, those repeat cases escalate to high risk cases over a period of time, and that can be a relatively short period of time. But you know, I think it is essential that we get the police to reconsider that issue of consent.
Good, thank you. I've got a question for Helen. So with Cardiff taxi companies, are you as SRS, do you have that sort of together working with them? It's just sort of, this is a really sort of anecdotal really. I know that when my son was living at home, sometimes he'd get a taxi from Cardiff late at night on a Friday or Saturday night, and they wouldn't actually drop him at the house, they'd drop him in the middle of Barry. So I just wondered whether there's, you know, that you've heard of that issue previously, or whether it was just his misfortune.
Right, thank you for that. Yeah, so the way SRS is structured in terms of licensing, we support the licensing function in each of the 3 authorities, but we do that kind of separately because clearly each authority has its own licensing committee. So yes, we provide the same function in Cardiff. I'm not aware of that issue that you've raised. I can certainly ask the question of the relevant team, and maybe perhaps by email you could give me some more information about the circumstances, okay, how that arose. But it's certainly not something that I've been aware of previously.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Buckley.
Thank you. Most of my questions have been answered. The only 2 I got left, and both for you, Helen, I apologise. Where you said about the information in the GP surgeries in leaflets, have you considered putting it on the rolling screens that put information up in the waiting areas? Because not everyone will pick up a leaflet to look at it, but whenever they're bored, they just watch the screen. And with the core blockers, brilliant that we fitted 61. I didn't know how much they cost, and if people had an option to get hold of them themselves, if we can't provide them for them.
Yeah, thanks, Councillor Buckley. So I'll start with the first question, or perhaps not so much a question, but a really, really good idea. And certainly that's something that we can look at. I have to say, you've probably got a posher GP surgery than I go to, because there's no rolling screen where I go. But yeah, all that we can do, and it ties in with how we're trying to kind of do that shift much more to the visual and to social media. Working with Councillor Avia at the moment to get something out she mentioned earlier about something unrelated, but again looking at how we can promote things and get that awareness out there through social media. So that's certainly something that we can look at in terms of the doctor's surgeries, etc. That's a great idea. So thank you for that. Core blockers, they are quite expensive. We have been successful in getting some grant funding to actually purchase some in, so we've been able to do that. What we probably need to do now is to review what we've got actually out and installed and see if there are any that we can almost recycle that perhaps are not needed anymore. So that is a piece of work that we will be doing, but we're always looking to increase the stock that we have. You mentioned whether individuals will be able to purchase them. We would always prefer that the core blockers come through us, because we can pick up on any related issues with them, and it's a much more holistic approach rather than advising people to just go out and buy one, if you understand what I mean. So certainly it's something that we're really keen to continue. We're always looking to increase the stock that we've got. And as I say, we have been successful with grant funding previously.
That's great, thank you. And I wasn't thinking of the holistic thing with the core blockers. I was just thinking if it was an option for people, if we didn't have any, we could give them. But thank you very much, cheers.
Thanks.
Councillor Hanks.
Thank you, Chair. A question for Mike. I was just wanting, under section D, page 23, you refer to home visits and the new challenges. So there were less home visits and a lot more telephone calls. Going forward, do you see that continuing or back to home visits? I just wondered how that was working and what the future held, please.
Yeah, I think we're going to move to a hybrid approach, aren't we? I think the use of technology and telephone calls allows obviously a greater spread in terms of contact, but I don't think in terms of safeguarding and issues, going back to the point Helen made just now, you can pick up on other issues in terms of those face-to-face conversations, things you see, things that you witness, and of course we in how we communicate, we communicate in sort of visual expression or mannerisms, and that highlights a number of other issues which perhaps you wouldn't get over a telephone call, so it will be a hybrid approach. I think members will have potentially have heard from our sort of third-party housing related support provider, Pobble, where there will be official opening of their face-to-face service at Hulton Road very shortly. So just to give you a flavour that I don't think it would be a one-size-fits-all solution for in all occasions, and that we would look to adopt a hybrid approach. But clearly there have been some benefits in the way that we've operated over the last couple of years that we'd want to hold on to as well.
Thank you.
Councillor Hennessy.
Hello, yes, thank you, Chair. This is a two-part from Mike. Do you find that having a neighbourhood watch deters antisocial behaviour, and how involved are neighbourhood watch?
In terms of neighbourhood watch, yes, I think we're great advocates, and certainly the community safety team support all of our community watch, neighbourhood watch areas. We have meet regularly with coordinators, and we support their activities. And I think particularly at a time when people were stuck in their houses and looking out of their windows in the last 2 years, I think what we've seen is that neighbourhoods did pull together, communities did pull together during the pandemic, and we would support those neighbourhood watch teams as far as possible. We think they're great advocates, great volunteers who do a lot of great work in terms of community safety activity.
Okay, thank you. As we have no more questions, that was for reference. Are we happy to move a note?
Yes, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Next agenda is agenda item 5, revenue monitoring for the period 1st of April to 31st of May 2022.
Hi, good evening. Thank you for having me. So this is the revenue monitoring to the end of May 2022. We have taken a slightly different approach to the monitoring this financial year. So what my intention was to do was to just pick up some of the kind of key headlines that we're seeing across the council in terms of themes, and then draw down into the specific notes for the areas in the committee's remit. So in terms of revenue in year, we're encountering a number of pressures that you'll all be aware of from the news and your professional and personal lives. So in terms of the high levels of inflation that we're seeing. So when we prepared the 22-23 revenue budget, we did allow for specific contractual inflation, but we didn't apply any general inflation to the budget. So I think some services are starting to see some pressures there. We've also potentially, we've applied a percentage increase for pay as an assumption, but obviously those pay negotiations are still ongoing and are expected to be quite complex this financial year. So there is some uncertainty there. In terms of energy costs, whilst fortunately we did buy the majority of our energy in advance of this financial year, we are seeing a particular pressure relating to standard standing charges, which is the element that obviously that we couldn't pre-purchase. So that's a pressure of about 300,000 across the council in this financial year. Obviously, we're going to see then significant pressures going forward in respect of energy, but in this financial year we're expecting that to be around 300,000, and we think we can manage that from within the kind of projected surplus in policy, although I haven't put a figure on that at the moment. In terms of COVID funding, as you'll be aware, the majority of the COVID funding ceased at the end of 21-22, and we have got some small residual amounts of funding that have continued into this financial year. So free school meals, some statutory sickness protection in the area of social services, and then also some residual amounts of self-isolation payments. In terms of specifically for housing, in terms of the kind of homeless approach which was applied throughout COVID, those places were pre-purchased in March 2022 for this financial year. So whilst there's no additional grant in this financial year, those places have been purchased in advance. I've put in a note about the kind of the arrangements for the Ukrainian arrangements, although it's very vague at the moment. I think that the exact funding arrangements are still emerging. We have started making those cash payments, so we've quite well advanced in terms of making those payments, and we are about to start making the £350 payments, which is for the kind of sponsorship monthly payments to the sponsorship families. But in terms of the grant funding, that's seems to be developing as we progress through the month. So we'll have more of an accurate update in September. So in terms of the services in this committee's remit, so in terms of youth offending service, private housing, regulatory services, general fund housing and HRA, there are no overspends projected at the moment, albeit we will need to keep under review the various pressures that I've outlined. There are efficiencies targets for general fund housing of £6,000 and £1,000 for private housing, and we will report back after the summer with hopefully more detail in terms of how those efficiency savings will be found. I think those are the main points that I was going to pick up in terms of the services, but I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, does anybody have any questions? I'm assuming that's a big fact. No, looking at the people not shaking their heads. Okay, so the recommendation for this is that we consider that the members consider the position with regard to the authority's 2022-23 revenue budget within the remit of the committee. Happy to move in notes? Yeah, and accept, yes?
Yes,
brilliant.
Chair.
Thank. Right, agenda item 6 is capital monitoring for the period 1st of April to 31st of May 2022.
Okay, thank you very much.
Hang on, just 2 seconds, Gemma. I've just seen that Mark Wilson has put his hand up. Sorry.
Will you give me permission for me to speak? Is that okay, Chair?
As long as committee are happy, I'm happy.
Thank you. I was just going to go.
See any dissenters?
I apologise for being late to the meeting. I'll try and get to any sort of relevant scrutiny committee. But I was at a residents' meeting before. But one issue I just want to raise briefly is that as I am responsible for some of this budget, not all of it, in terms of most of the building services element, I am keeping a close eye on things. Obviously, we did have some issue with garden waste and the green waste, as you probably are aware. And we've had to increase wages, admittedly temporarily for 6 months, to try and attract people, because as you know out there, it is difficult to attract drivers. But I'm pleased to say things are working really well in that area now, and I've had a lot less complaints. In fact, I've had quite a lot of compliments from members, even some members here, around thanking the service people, and I've passed those comments on. And can I also say I'm really trying to be on top of this as much as possible, but we do live in challenging times at the moment. You know, inflation is not going to go away. If anything, it could get worse than than it is at the moment. But I will keep a watching brief, and I'll also be very keen for members of this committee or any other committees to offer their insight and any suggestions of saving money or even generating income. So I'm always very keen to hear from members, right? Because, you know, you're the Scrutiny Committee. If you want to make any recommendations, suggestions, anything that I can look at, I'm more than happy to do that. But thank you.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Wilson. Gemma, if you'd like to continue, please. And Mark, could you please lower your hand? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So this is capital monitoring to the end of May. So I think a global kind of headlines for the council are, as you'll be aware, inflation costs are high, particular issues in the construction industry in terms of the cost of materials, shortage of professional skills. So what we are seeing across the capital programme are schemes going out to tender, coming back over budget, having to be retendered, redesigned, or additional funding sought. And we're also seeing quite long lead times on certain items, not necessarily impacting this committee, although could well do, but certainly things like vehicles, we're looking at 2-3 year lead times. So they're the kind of general issues that we're seeing across the capital programme. I mean, specifically for this committee, paragraph 2.19 of the report sets out the allocation of the housing improvement programme in this financial year. And just to clarify, where it refers to IHP, that refers to the heating retrofit scheme within the housing improvement programme. So that's a very ambitious, challenging budget, and I think we're expecting that will need to be revised in year to reflect capacity to deliver it, and then some of these challenges that we're seeing around inflationary costs as well, and the need to redesign, and also professional skills. The other item that I wanted to pick up was around the Enable grant. It's set out in the report that we've been allocated a sum of 202,000 additional grant. However, 40,000 of this does relate to the lifting of the means testing. So that needs to be subject to a further review prior to us commencing with that. So we have accepted at this stage just the 161,000, and a further review will be taking place in terms of what the approach should be in terms of listing the means testing, because there's various ways that can be managed prior to accepting any further grant. Again, happy to take any questions on the report.
Okay, thank you very much, Gemma. Do we have any questions? Councillor Hanks.
Hi, thank you, Gemma. I was just wanting to know about the electric vehicles, really. I think you've ordered 12 electric vehicles to replace 12 diesel cars. I don't know how many cars there are in the pool. Would you know how many cars in the pool? And with people working from home and various other things, how many do we anticipate wanting to have in the future? Thank you.
I believe there are 40 cars in the pool, although I can certainly check that and clarify that by email. So only proportion of the pool, and obviously in terms of having the electric vehicles, it's important that you also have the infrastructure to make sure that they can be charged and utilised effectively. So I think we've got the electric vehicles in place, but we have interim arrangements in terms of charging the vehicles. So the charging points, the permanent charging points, haven't been put in place yet at the Alps and the Civic, although that is intended to be carried out shortly. So this would need to be a phased approach, but I believe there are targets for transferring our fleet over to electric, or and I think they're certainly before the 2030 Project Zero deadline. So it's something that we will need to work towards, but I think this was very much intended to be a trial. Whilst we still develop this hybrid approach to working that we're applying and see what the implications of that are. But I can just double check in terms of the number of vehicles in the fleet and what the deadline is, because I remember it being around 2025, but I don't know if that's been pushed back due to COVID, so I'd need to clarify.
Thank you.
Okay, Mike, if you'd like to come in.
Yeah, it was, I don't know the exact number either, but it was just so that you're aware that there is a review going on at the moment in terms of pool car use. That review has slightly changed given the recent cost of the cost of living and cost of fuel issues. Because yes, there was a change in terms of pool car use during the pandemic. We weren't using the pool cars as frequently, clearly as often as we had been. And also in terms of home working arrangements, there was greater latitude in terms of staff using their own vehicles in terms of undertaking visits rather than picking vehicles up from the pool car centres. That clearly is a concern for our staff at the moment in terms of their own usage, given the cost of fuel, and obviously that's a concern across the entire social care sector. Clearly in terms of those providing home care. So there is a review going on. I don't think it's finished yet. I know some staff raised concerns and issues directly with the chief executive at recent meetings. I think a lot of the activity around electric vehicles is based on grant coming into the authority via Welsh Government. And of course, I think we will see programmes, certainly in relation to net carbon zero and carbon reduction, increasing, that activity increasing over the next few years. So, as I say, I can't give much detail in terms of pool car use specifically, other than to say there is a review going on. There will be a reduction in the number of vehicles, but we're trying to reflect that in terms of the new way of working in the council in terms of that hybrid working.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Mike.
Councillor Buckley.
Just one question. With regard to the vehicles and the carbon emissions, a lot of the military now are looking past electric and they're going towards hydrogen. Have you looked at that at all?
We've certainly had conversations that I've not necessarily been party to, but I've had it mentioned to me that I know there's some thoughts that the hydrogen certainly would be required for some of the larger fleet. So when we're talking about things like waste vehicles, we probably would need to wait for hydrogen to be a possibility. But I mean, I think our impression at the moment is that the technology is not there for us to utilise at the moment, but it's something that we'll be watching with a very close eye in the coming years, because I would imagine that technology is going to need to advance very quickly in the coming years. So I think we just need to keep an eye on the industry and see what's developing and what's coming forward.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I don't see any more hands up. I don't see anybody else wanting to ask any questions. There are 4 recommendations to this. Okay, so they are rather large recommendations, but I will go through them one by one. The first recommendation is that the committee notes the progress made on delivering the 2022 to 23 capital programme for the schemes in the scrutiny remit. Are we happy with this recommendation?
Yes,
okay.
Chair.
Recommendation 2, that committee notes the use of delegated authority in relation to the following: school decarbonisation programme PV panels, to increase the scheme budget by 16,000 to be funded from the Energy Management Reserve. Happy with that?
Yes,
Chair.
Okay. The Old Hall in Cowbridge, renewal of roof coverings and Wickham Marcross Primary School internal alterations. Happy with that? Sorry, via 41,000 from the Education Asset Renewal Contingency Budget. Split 27,000 to Old Hall, Cowbridge, renewal of roof coverings, and 14,000 to Wickham Marcross Primary internal alterations. Happy with that?
Yes,
Yes,
Chair.
Chair.
Yes, Chair.
Yeah.
Street lighting along Frampton Lane, increase the 2022 to 23 capital programme by 20,000 using S106 monies. Happy?
Yes,
Yes,
Chair.
Chair.
Almost done. Steel Park Public Art increased the 2022 to 23 capital programme by 20,000, also funded from Section 106 monies.
Yes,
Yes,
Chair.
Chair.
Okay.
Yes, Chair.
Housing Improvement Programme, allocate the 2022-23 budget to the scheme as detailed in paragraph 2.20. Yep.
Yes, Chair.
Yes,
Chair.
And the Wickham Marcross Primary internal alterations increase the 2022-23 capital programme by 70,000 to be funded from Section 106.
Yes, Chair.
Yes,
Okay.
Chair.
Recommendation number 3, that committee notes the use of emergency powers as detailed in the attached appendix. Everyone happy with that?
Yes.
And several more things on agenda item 4. Do you want me to go through these one at a time, or are you happy to accept them all in one go?
Happy
Accept
to
all
accept
in
them
one
all.
go.
Okay, save me time. Okay, so that is agenda item 6 done and dusted. Thank you very much, Gemma. Where's my agenda now? There it is. Now, agenda item 7 is the annual delivery plan monitoring report, quarter 4 performance 2021 to 22.
Thank you, Chair. I'll lead on this, and I'm sure Helen will chip in and potentially answer any questions that committee have in relation to her specific area. Clearly, as it's a cross-corporate report, there may be areas of members' interest that the relevant officers are not in attendance at committee this evening, and just a reflection really on that in future reports like this, if there are specific areas that are of interest, please let us know, and we can obviously ensure that the relevant officers are available to answer on the evening. Members will be pleased to know I'm not going to lead you through 166 pages of the report. And I'll be perfectly honest, I haven't read 166 pages of the report either. However, what I have done and what I have reported, and Helen will have also reported on, is the areas that are specific to this committee. But what I will do is to give the report the credit that is due, really, is just to lead you through the executive summary, if I may, because it's a good news story. It's a good news story in so far as it's an end of year report, I suppose, in sort of school speak. And what it's basically saying is we've done, as a local authority, as a corporate body, we've done exceptionally well in delivering our corporate priorities and meeting our annual delivery plan targets. As you can see from the report is indicating that we've met, we've got good performance, green performance against our 4 corporate plan wellbeing objectives. And in terms of cross-council, what that means in numbers, we've got 321 objectives, and of those, 287 of them have been attributed a green performance rating, and only 34 activities which we've not achieved. The report goes on to explain why we've not achieved some of those. Some of those were directly as a result of the COVID pandemic. Some of them are around reprioritisation of services. And there will be other factors. And as you can see from the report, in terms of the coronavirus recovery plan, there is an element within the report which is showing how we are going through that recovery phase. Although, as we all know, the trends are not looking good at the moment in terms of numbers. And I don't think I've known so many people, associates, colleagues, who are testing positive at the moment. So I think it fairly appears to be, even though I think Helen will explain we've probably moved to the endemic phase, those numbers are continuing to rise, and I'm sure she'll be able to give you an update on the current picture. Moving on, in the report, we also have performance measures, and of the performance measures that are in our corporate plan and align with our corporate plan wellbeing objectives, 67 of those are reported. The majority of those, 72%, are on target or achieving above target. A small number that are amber, and 14 or 21% that have a red status. There are quite a number of our targets which were new targets, and we don't report on those in the first year. We establish a baseline performance, but they will be reported on in future years. If I move on to this committee's activities, as you can see, we've also been attributed a green performance status for planned activities within this scrutiny committee's remit. 92% of our activities are on track or complete, and only 3 of our measures attributed a red status. And what I'll do is, as we go through the report, I'll just mention those areas and why we've not met the targets in those. We have 18 measures, 67% were identified as green, again a small number amber, and a relatively small number, only 2 were attributed a red status. If I move on then to Appendix A, and Appendix A will lead you to the activities under this committee's remit. So it's, you know, you don't have to read the 166. It focuses you on those that are more pertinent to the committee. You can see on page 2 of Appendix A, noted at page 2, a visualization of what I've just explained. And on page 3, some outcomes and what we've achieved in terms of some narrative. So I'll just take a little bit of time just to sort of give you a flavour of those. There's more detail within the body of the report in terms of detail, but just to reflect on what we've done in the last 12 months, community tensions monitoring has been improved in the council as a result of tensions as a result of Brexit and more recently the Ukraine crisis. We completed our pledges in terms of Syrian and Afghan families, and under the regional scheme that we had with Cardiff, we continue to support our guests in accommodation. We've been providing training and training up some of our residents and volunteers as digital champions as we move our technology across to the different way of working which I mentioned earlier. We're also making sure that our tenants are on the same journey as us, and we're all learning how to use our ICT, I'm sure, in a better fashion. In terms of the work that we're doing around supporting our learning, our employment, pleasing to see that all of our tenancies, our 329 tenancies that were let during the year, have been maintained for a period of in excess of 6 months, and I suppose reflects the amount of targeted supporting people activity and money advice activity that we provide to tenants to ensure that they are sustainable. And perhaps an area that new members particularly may be unaware of is the amount of work that we do within service in terms of supporting people into work and training placements. And as you can see there, that we continue to deliver training opportunities, particularly to those who live in our accommodation, who needs not in education, employment and training. And as you can see, in terms of the Communities for Work scheme, we encourage 76 enrolments in year. In terms of supporting people at home, a mention earlier around target hardening. Of those that we provided target hardening, 100% when surveyed of our victims reported feeling safer. Food establishments, 97% of our food establishments are broadly compliant with standards. DFGs, disabled facilities grants, a high proportion of people who have a grant are satisfied those adaptations make them feel safer and more dependent. In terms of objective 4, around respecting, enhancing and enjoying our environment, We have a pilot project at the moment in a number of council properties across the Vale, looking at optimised retrofit, where we're looking at air source heat pumps. We're doing some work at the moment with Swansea University, analysing their performance and what improvements we need to make. I think what has been difficult for us to assess and to analyse is, given rising electricity prices, some of the benefits that we had hoped to see in terms of the type of technology that we're using, perhaps from our tenants' perspective, they don't see the gains. But what I would say is the technology in terms of heat source pumps go hand in hand then with fabric first approach in terms of insulating our properties, making sure that they're properly insulated, and obviously some work now looking at how we insulate our floors as well, because that's an issue as well in terms of some of the measures that we've introduced. Also, just to a big shout out to my staff and other volunteers and members who have supported the various food schemes across the Vale that have come into being over the last year or so. Clearly, we have the Penarth Food Project, which we've delivered at St Luke's Avenue in Penarth. That is going from strength to strength. We've also tagged on to the food pod there the ability now to provide bespoke services to those that are going for food, but also being able to provide other wraparound holistic services in the information hub, which is now attached to that building. And we also reflect on other food schemes, the Llantuit CF61 scheme, Food Share, and Big Books for Boyd in Barry. And finally, some of the environmental work that colleagues in neighbourhood services doing, particularly in terms of the work that we did around sprinkling Cymru throughout the Vale. Moving on in terms of some of the detail, and I'll just reflect on those red actions which I've mentioned. And as you can see on page 4 of Appendix A, 3 actions that are performance exceptions. And I'll just quickly run through those. We had hoped to complete our older person accommodation with care strategy by the end of the year. That's now targeted. Well, I've seen the draft, but it's anticipated that was going to be completed in Q1 of 22-23. The second one that we've missed there, and I think Gemma highlighted that earlier, is that we have had an impact in terms of availability of contractors, availability of supplies, and you can see our housing development programme has slipped. That's not to say we won't be delivering the developments that we'd hoped to deliver and finish last year, but some of them will be either started at the back end of last year or are due to commence this year. So, as I say, a slipped development programme, unfortunately. And finally, a discussion that we had at last committee about the Gypsy and Traveller work, and I think I highlighted that, as I say, at last committee meeting. Moving finally on then, performance indicators that have not been met or objectives not been met. There are only 2 for this committee, and they relate to our prevention measures. We are one of, or were prior to COVID, one of the most highest performing authorities in relation to our performance, our prevention work. But clearly, given COVID, there was limited prevention activity we could do, and the majority of people had to be rehoused anyway. So there was little emphasis placed on prevention in that regard. So that's a quick whistle-stop tour in terms of the report and flagging some of the good work that we're doing. I've stopped short of going through the coronavirus recovery work because I think we've probably spoken about that in other reports during this and the last committee. There may be some specific areas that Helen might wish to flag, I know, I've mentioned the work of the team who've been involved in test. You'll have to remind me, TTP, test, trace, track. I've forgotten
Test,
the
trace and
Protect.
protect, isn't
protect.
it? Yeah.
There we go. And Helen may just wish to sort of perhaps flag that issue there, as I highlighted it as I went through the report. But then Helen and I are happy to answer any questions that committee may have. Thank you, Chair.
No problem, Mike. Go ahead, Helen.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I think it's useful just to update members on where we are currently with the COVID response, and we're continuing to make good headway in emerging from the sort of response status that we've been in for the last couple of years. And on the 1st of July, Friday just passed, was another milestone in that, with the sort of paring back of the requirements in place. TTP now is still functioning, but is very much targeting those high risk settings rather than breaking chains of transmission in the general public. And the SRS support for that is now reflecting that in line with that sort of paring back. And I probably mentioned this to you before, but for us now, the trick is, the balancing act for us is that we maintain those skills within the service, so that if we see a huge uptake in numbers, particularly as we go into the autumn and the winter, that we're able to gear up quickly. And it is a concern that numbers, and Mike has hinted at this earlier, we're seeing a lot of colleagues becoming unwell with COVID at the moment. What that translates into in the autumn and winter months, particularly if there's a new variant, that's what we need to be very, very mindful of. So we're making good progress. We've got pretty much all of our staff now back in their substantive posts, but we are keeping one eye firmly on the autumn.
Okay, thank you. Does anybody have any questions at all? Hennessy, Councillor Hennessy, if you would like to speak, thank you. You're on mute.
Yeah, I got that bit.
There you go.
Thank you, Chair. 2 questions for Mike. Do we know where we are on the Colcott Clinic project at the moment? And the second question is, the new computer system, what was put in for tenants to report complaints and do things, is that up and running fully now?
Okay, we've just gone into contract for the Colcott Clinic, and we had our first contractor meeting this afternoon. I'll bring you updates in terms of our housing development programme, specifically for this committee's attention as we move through the year. So yes, very pleased that we were able to identify a contractor. I think Gemma reflected earlier that in terms of some of our estimating on what housing development costs were compared to 12 months ago, we're seeing huge price inflation, and clearly we're in a position at the moment where we can afford to continue to deliver our housing development programme even with inflated prices. However, as we move through the next few years of our housing development programme, we might see that some of our work might be at risk as we go probably through towards the end of the next 4 or 5 years, because clearly we're using a lot more capital in the programme. In terms of your second question, it's almost as if you've primed me, Councillor Hennessy. We had our first project board meeting this morning with NEC, who are the contractors who are going to be providing our replacement housing and building services IT system. So the first board meeting was today. They're in the process of building, because we're moving from, I'm not a technical, I don't profess to be particularly IT literate. We're moving away from information that's held on servers to information that's held on the cloud, and colleagues are currently building the cloud platform on which our housing system will sit. Once that phase is complete, we have a program now developed. It's a two-phase program. Phase one is to get all of the functionality we currently have within our system, but also a new housing maintenance contractor system, because that is a priority for us, given that the technology that we're using within housing maintenance is outdated. To get those services online, our end date at the moment, and these things, you know, may fluctuate, but at the moment we're anticipating phase one completion in May 2023. So we've got an awful lot of work to do at the moment, then building the modules. Then once the cloud platform is in place, I'm told we then build the modules and a lot of consultancy work and working with NEC to get that in place. What we will do in phase two is a lot of the, I would call the bells and whistles. So the non-core functionality, which is going to provide us with benefits, both in terms of our tenant having benefits, in terms of being able to self-report, online reporting, and that functionality that we all want to see. There will be some online reporting functionality that tenants already have at the moment using the existing system, and that will be built into phase one. So our residents and customers shouldn't see a noticeable difference in what they can do now. But in terms of where the game changer will be in phase two, where we will be able to offer a full suite of remote services to tenants, should they wish to choose to do so. But we will continue to offer a range of alternatives for residents who want to communicate with us via telephone or face to face. So that's sort of where we are at the moment. So as I say, almost a setup question in that both of those things happened today.
just one of those things.
That's timing for you.
Well, I would like to, sorry, Chair, I would like to praise your team, because with all the hard work they do, I think we have to congratulate you. And with this new computer system, it will free up all the housing officers to be able to report things better and be able to go and see more clients and be able to do more work where they're able to do it all on a laptop quicker. It makes a lot of sense.
I absolutely agree. And even though we've already moved to a hybrid system, it does require from time to time, obviously, officers to come into the office to undertake some of the activities that they can't do because the technology doesn't allow us to do that. I think what we will see going forward is very limited use of office accommodation, and that's how it should be. The neighbourhood team should be out in the neighbourhoods with the people that they're supporting, in all honesty. And I suppose people's cars or vehicles or homes will become their new offices. But we are mindful that we are working in terms of that corporate hybrid policy. We're working on that at the moment, because clearly we also have concerns then in relation to well-being and safety of our staff when we're not seeing them on a regular basis, perhaps face to face. So yeah, just to sort of reflect that as well.
Thank you, Mike. Councillor Lovelock-Edwards.
Thank you, Chair. Mike, you've already referenced the ongoing issue then, for want of a better term, with regards to the travellers. But I note in the, you say you haven't read the 167 pages, but refer you to page 126, where it actually references that the travellers themselves withdrew from a planned consultation process. Was there a specific reason why they changed their mind? And I appreciate that the efforts that have been undertaken to engage with that community, but is there, I suppose, any linkage with the wider Gypsy and Traveller and Romany community across South Wales to sort of encourage them to participate in such a consultation?
Yeah, one of the reasons for the delay in providing the report, and the finalised report has yet to go to Welsh Government and is still being considered internally within the council. Part of the delay is that we extended the consultation period. We have had informal discussions with and it's the group, particularly that the traveller group that we've had is referred to in the report. We have had informal consultation with that group in the past, outside of a formal GTA Gypsy Traveller Needs Assessment process. Our previous assessment a couple of years ago, again, we had the same issue of involvement in participating in the review. I think there are concerns with that community about how people perceive them, what they feel that information might lead to, I suppose, a concern, how that might impact on how we respond to their needs going forward. In terms of the most recent assessment, and it will be reflected in the report in terms of the lack of engagement, we did commission Gypsy Traveller Wales as an intermediary between the council and the residents there to try and overcome perhaps some of those barriers. And whilst there was an indication in principle that the group would engage, unfortunately, even though we distributed questionnaires and Gypsy Traveller Wales were on hand to assist in terms of completion of those, unfortunately the group chose not to submit any returns, which, you know, is very difficult then in terms of policy direction, in terms of how do you meet those needs. And I think it was similar issues a number of years ago when we were considering potential delivery options in terms of accommodation for the residents there. Informally, those discussions that we had with residents going back probably a couple of years ago, certainly was before before COVID, so probably 3 years or so ago. Very much a desire that any accommodation that is provided is on the residents' terms, insofar as they don't require or don't want a traditional site in the same way as you might understand perhaps similar sites in other areas of Wales with traditional hard standings, communal areas, play areas. Very much a desire to develop a site potentially on their own, would prefer to basically be allocated perhaps potentially some land and be able to as I say, to use that land as they wish. I think that's the sort of area that the council will continue to work at and continue to work with. I'm aware we're open and to dialogue. We do have dialogue with the residents from time to time. We do continue to undertake regulatory inspection of the site to ensure fire safety and other measures that are required on the site. Obviously, we still own the land, and as a result of which we still have some responsibilities there. So it is a shame. However, I think, you know, the policy, the national policy, but also the local policy is we want to deliver necessarily something that people where people want to live, and in the same way as people in bricks and mortar want to live where they want to live in accommodation that they feel is appropriate. And in the same way and in an equitable way, we want to try and get to a resolution one way or the other where the residents there, that, you know, because they're part of, you know, the travellers in Sully have been resident at Sully for a period of time, but had been previously resident in Penarth as well. So, you know, they're part of our community. I'm not aware, certainly in terms of community cohesion issues generally and access to services, we're not aware of concerns and issues raised by any organisations or statutory bodies or anything like that. The residents there want to keep themselves to themselves and lead a peaceful, happy life. So, but we, as I say, we are continuing to look at that because we do need to resolve that situation. They are identified as a group in need necessarily. We obviously need to look at the proposals in terms of our LDP, because there's a requirement clearly within that process that where you have an identified need, you're required to meet that need. And I think it's probably going to be an issue that will continue to be worked at for some time yet. I don't think there's a quick and easy resolution, to be honest.
Thank you, Chair.
Councillor Hanks.
Oh, thank you, Chair. Mike, I just wondered, I'm sure it's going to be a huge problem with the increase in numbers of families, because the eviction process has now started with large debts and extensive arrears. I just wondered how we're going to cope with this problem, please.
Yes, we're already seeing. We'd anticipated clearly in terms of the eviction measures that were introduced as part of legislation back last year or the year before, that those measures were going to be released. They have done. That has resulted in an increased number of families coming to us looking for support and help. What is not also helping is the fact that that is also being fueled by landlords issuing Section 21 notices now on accommodation. We're seeing a number of small landlords. It might be their pension provision, you know, or whatever the case may be, but relatively small landlords with one or two properties, given the house price inflation in the Vale, looking obviously to an opportunity there in terms of sale of property, and obviously asking their tenants and leaving the sector. How do we respond to that? There's great pressure at the moment in terms of temporary accommodation. We have a range of temporary accommodation for families. We're seeing that being used much more often, and that's a growing issue that we're looking to address. A couple of mitigation that we're looking at. We obviously have what's called the VAT scheme, the Vale Assisted Tenancy Scheme in the Vale. So of course we provide bonds, rents in advance. So that's one area that we use in order to prevent and to access private sector housing opportunities. We have a local leasing scheme, so we're not part of the Welsh Government leasing scheme, but we have our own leasing scheme called Hafod Cartrefi, which we operate. So Hafod, for example, will take on the leases of properties, and we will then nominate and refer people into those long leases, 3, 5 years, 7 years, whatever we can negotiate. And that's a great help and provides additional capacity. And clearly, we continue to build council housing. Our waiting list is touching on 7,000 now. We've got over 800 families who we deem to be in high priority, looking for accommodation or waiting for accommodation on that waiting list. And we continue to build family housing. Just a note there, the accommodation at Hayes Road has been slightly delayed, but we're looking at potentially a relet date sometime this month. We had hoped it was going to be May, and then it was June. There's been a slight issue there in relation to sprinklers, because all of our homes, as members will be aware, now require sprinkler systems, and there'd been an issue in terms of microchips, as I understand it. in that there's a wool shortage in that technology. But that will provide, a substantial number of, particularly for Barry, a number of houses, family-sized houses. They're all let, and our tenants are looking forward to moving in as soon as possible. So those are the means that we operate. We clearly are also aware, and I suppose we supported the Welsh Government's view to suspend the implementation of the Renting Homes Act until December to give us a little bit more time to prepare. We are constrained in terms of our resources at the moment in trying to respond to Ukraine and the crisis there in terms of the response that the Vale is giving. So that gives us a little bit of breathing space. But I suppose it also gives us a further opportunity to work with private sector landlords and others around encouraging and encouraging them to remain within the private rented market, and further opportunities to develop that. We are looking at we're always looking at our landlord offer. How do we make that more attractive? How do we, as I say, keep people in the market that might otherwise be tempted to cash the chips and sell properties? So we're reviewing the offer. We're looking at issues around tenancy, the issues around tenancy insurance schemes. We're looking at that at the moment, about whether we can look at something like that. And we'll review whether there is a benefit to us. We think the scheme in the Vale is a little more generous than the Welsh Government national scheme, leasing scheme. It gives us a bit more flexibility in what we can offer as a local authority. So there are other things that we're looking at to encourage landlords, new landlords to come in and work with us, or remaining landlords to sort of stay with us. We're welcome. We've received some further grant funding this week from Welsh Government. We've now been provided with some funding to appoint within the Vale. I don't like the term czar, but a rapid rehousing coordinator that will work cross council and cross agencies to try and pull all of this work together. As we know, homelessness is not a housing issue in itself. There are lots of factors which result in homelessness and people having housing stress. So we're very thankful of that additional resource. But we've also been given some additional revenue to increase the access to discretionary housing payments, increase the number of bonds and rents in advance that we have, but also in some circumstances to assist in looking at issues like arrears in private sector tenancies, and trying to encourage some of our landlords perhaps to enter into arrangements with us around some of those issues. So that's all very welcome. Sorry, it's a long answer really for what was what are we doing?
I think it was good. Yeah. It's nice to know there are so many, because we're getting concerned about what's happening out there, and I think that was a comprehensive answer. Thank you, Mike.
I think in summary we're doing an awful lot at the moment across a whole variety of priorities.
Okay, thank you. I have one more person wanting to speak. Go ahead, Councillor Perks.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to ask a couple of things, really. Talk about the Gypsy and Traveller site. The actual site opposite the one that's on Sully at the moment, that's having buildings demolished and stuff like that, do we actually own that land, or do we have access to use any of that land? Would that be suitable for a Traveller site, part of it?
Your local knowledge is better than mine, Councillor Perks. I'm not sure what demolition.
Where Beechwood College is, opposite there used to be all office buildings there. I know that some of them have been knocked down and stuff like that. Yeah. I just wondered whether that's ours or.
I know there is some land there that we own. I think it's a bit further down Hayes Road, so I'm
Right.
minded to think it's probably part of the residue of the estate from BP, but I'm not certain. But I'll certainly ask the question and speak to colleagues about that.
Yeah.
One of the issues clearly with the existing site, as we know, and in terms of the planning inspector's review of that site previously, are issues around flooding. And concerns around it being in the floodplain there. So whether that's an issue, because I know on the site opposite Beechwood and there's an awful lot of pumping that goes on there in terms of flooding on what was the old BP area.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Mike. And my other question is, with sort of the level of people wanting homes and stuff like that, I know we've got those temporary homes on Court Road. Could that be duplicated on other sites, that we could have temporary modular homes, or my favourite, converted shipping containers put on other land that we have? Is that a possibility, you know, that could be? And would we have the funding from, say, Welsh Government to actually do that thing? Because obviously the Vale can't afford to do everything, but I just wonder whether it's a possibility on perhaps land that we have at the moment.
Sorry, Mike, just a second. Councillor Perks, I raised this myself in a previous meeting, and I was told it would depend on things like power supply and how much it would cost to get power to certain areas. But I'll let Mike expand.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think Court Road was seen as a great success. The only thing with Court Road is it was a year in the making, and so what we're looking at is looking at the potential to look at ready sites, I suppose, following on from Councillor Collins's point. We are looking at some active sites at the moment. I don't really want to, because they're at the appraisal stage, and I don't really want the set hairs running. But we are looking at some active sites at the moment, potentially, that we could place some form of more temporary modular type accommodation on. We're talking to Cardiff at the moment, because obviously Cardiff have developed their scheme at the back of IKEA, I think, on the gasworks site there, which is very much based on container type technology. So we're in discussion whether there's a regional approach that might accelerate some of those opportunities. But the issue for us is land, and it takes as long, you know, it would be nice to have a greenfield site, but then the time is taken then in terms of, you know, putting in sewage mains, water mains, electricity. So we're looking at some brownfield sites at the moment. We're also looking at more urgent measures that may not be the traditional measures at the moment, because I think we reflect on the pressure that, you know, clearly Wales is a nation of sanctuary, and clearly we're doing all we can to assist, both in terms of our existing resettlement programmes, but also, as I say, the catastrophe that's in Ukraine at the moment. And we're looking at potentially some other measures that we can look to assist, not just people that are fleeing war in Ukraine, but also measures that will assist our own residents equally, who are in desperate need as well, as we know. So we are, just to reassure, we are looking. We have some active sites that we're considering.
Cool.
And hopefully when you come back from recess, as I say, perhaps we can put a report together for you in terms of where some of those activities are.
Thank you, Mike. I'm looking forward to hearing that we've got some new sites. Thank you.
That would be very good news indeed. As I said, I've mentioned this a couple of times now in previous meetings. So I really look forward to the day when we can get that report and we can get more developments like that in place. That will really help the situation. Councillor Hennessy.
Yeah, Mike, as we were talking about Cross John today, I just noticed on page 146 Any update on the sustainable alternative sewage arrangement?
So the priority in the action plan there is about that we have a number of remote rural sites that remain on original cesspit arrangements, which are really no longer fit for purpose. They're too small. They were designed at a different time when people didn't have all of the white goods and what have you. So the action there relates to a cesspit at Marcross specifically, but other areas as well. Croft John also has a cesspit arrangement for those properties. We're currently working through at Marcross. We currently have a proposal in place in terms of an alternative replacement works. Clearly that comes at a cost. And quite an extensive cost, and residents are required to contribute to the cost of the as part of their covenants, particularly those that are, well, the council will obviously pay for those that are still council tenants, but there's a high proportion of people who have purchased their properties through right to buy. There's a requirement in covenant for them to contribute a fair and proportionate cost to the cost of maintaining, upgrading, replacing those works. We're working through that at the moment because people's ability to afford to contribute varies. We have some very elderly people who have no means of regular income that couldn't afford to pay their contributions in that regard. So we're working our way through the legal basis on which we can come to a satisfactory conclusion, an equitable conclusion for all. Once we've done that, we've been working quite clearly, and I know ward boundaries have changed, but we were working particularly clearly with the ward members that included Marcross. It has been something I've worked in the Vale for 30 years. This has been discussed for probably the last 25. It's something that I've committed will be delivered, and will be delivered not in the next 25 years. What will then happen is once we've got that model, we will look to Croft John as well and start to have consultation and conversations with the residents there. Just so the members are aware, the cost of emptying a cesspit, given the remote location, the country lanes, they have to be emptied more regularly. It costs an absolute fortune for the residents to contribute to their costs of that emptying, and is causing some, extreme financial issues for residents, some of the residents there. So yeah, the quicker we resolve that, the better.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Do we have any other questions? Okay, then, so there are 3 recommendations for this. The first is that members consider performance results and progress achieving the annual delivery plan 2021-22 commitments as aligned to corporate plan wellbeing objectives within the remit of the committee. Are we happy with that?
Yes.
The second recommendation is that members consider the remedial actions to be taken to address areas of underperformance and to tackle the key challenges identified within the remit of the committee, with their views and recommendations referred thereafter to Cabinet for their consideration and approval. Happy with that?
Yes, Chair.
Yes, Chair.
And the final recommendation is that members note the progress being made through our recovery strategy and directorate recovery plans in response to the ongoing coronavirus pandemic. Are we happy to accept that?
Yes, Chair.
Yes, Chair.
Okay, well, in that case, that brings agenda item number 7 to a close. Agenda item number 8 is any items which Chair has decided is urgent under part 1. I have none. Agenda item 9 is any items which the Chair has decided are urgent under part 2. I have none. So all that remains me to say is all that I need to say now is to say thank you very much for attending. We don't have another meeting now until September. The next meeting is currently scheduled for the 7th of September. So I will probably see some of you in other meetings, but for those of you I do not see in meetings, have a good summer recess in August, and I will speak to you in September. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.